Welcome back to Stranded in Pittsburgh. Nick and Nate without Ethan once again. Nate's laughing, but it's to mask the pain that Ethan just can't seem to string together multiple appearances in a row, and I think it's really starting to take its toll on me. And Nate, it looks like it's the same case for you.
I mean, come on, he missed the Michael McHenry interview. Now he's missing this show. Big Pitt Notre Dame preview, talking Steelers Rams. So he's missing a lot of content, but I guess we'll let him go for this one.
Yeah, we'll let him off easy. It's been a week covering a lot of high school stuff, getting his name out there as only he can, posting wonderful videos on his Twitter previewing the games. And we say that as a joke, but honestly, he puts out good content all the time. So Ethan, we love you, and hopefully you listen to this one. If you do, send me a text with the word bacon in it, and that's how I know you listened. And if not, then we know you're scum who doesn't even support his own show. And for new viewers, you probably already tuned out. But anyway, excited to have you back. As Nate kind of touched on, we're going to talk about the Steelers, talk about Pitt Notre Dame, and what the hell is going on with the Penguins. But we'll jump right into what puts butts in the seats, and that is the Pittsburgh Steelers. Very weird win over the Los Angeles Rams. I missed the beginning of the game, caught the last possession of the first half where they scored the touchdown. That's they being the Rams, and then got to watch the second half. But Nate, the win, even though it looked like they improved in a lot of ways, the win's kind of been overshadowed by how the Rams lost the game more so than what the Steelers did towards the end of the game to get the momentum swung in their favor. What do you make of that win?
I mean, overall, I think we saw vast improvement in that second half, and especially from Kenny Pickett. The offense just looked the way it should. I mean, what a lot of people saw in the preseason is what we saw in that second half for the Steelers. And it continues to beg the question of why can't they do that all game long? I mean, Pickett looked much better, had a lot more zip and touch on the ball. His timing was really good with a lot of the routes they were running. Deontay Johnson back in the mix. I mean, I think opened up things for George Pickens, who ended up on the day with 5 receptions, 107 yards. So I think the offense, again, they show these glimmers of hope, but they can't put it together through 60 minutes. So, hopefully they can take a lot from this in that second half and move forward. Defensively, again, the Steelers played relatively solid. Minkah Fitzpatrick was pretty much all over the field. TJ Watt with the huge interception to start the second half, and the first play set up the Steelers offense. Honestly, if it's not for that play, who knows if the Steelers start rolling offensively. They get their first rushing touchdown of the year, Kenny Pickett. Then they add 2 more rushing touchdowns on the year behind, who would have thought Dan Moore leading the way on a couple of those runs, had a much more, solid game from him as well. So I think a lot of good improvements and talking points from that second half. First half, a lot left to be desired out there. Again, the offense struggled, but Brett Maher missing a field goal and an extra point, left the window open for the Steelers. And if he doesn't miss those 2 field goals, that game's a lot closer right there at the end. That spotting that I'm sure we'll touch on is a much bigger factor.
Yeah, that spotting is a little more of a sensitive subject if those field goals were all made. But yeah, you hit on all the main talking points. No rushing touchdowns all year. They fire off 3 in the second half with 3 different guys, I believe, scoring all of them. Deontay Johnson came back. That's something you touched on last week, and his impact was immediate. Some really long receptions. And one of the storylines of the game was the taunting penalties that Pittsburgh was receiving that were really poorly timed. Not like there's ever a good time for those things. But we saw George Pickens, we saw Najee, we saw Deontay Johnson. All of them were kind of running their mouths. A few times there were flags, one basically negating a pretty nice Pickens gain. Today in press conferences, interviews, and what have you, Tomlin kind of said that it was more of an issue of they needed to feel out the referee corps from that game. Najee said they were a little too loosey-goosey. In layman's terms, in Nick terms, that's the term we'll use, loosey-goosey with the flags.
Right after I'll just want to touch on that whole comment. I was listening to the post-game show after the Steelers game on the radio, and Tomlin was in his press conference, and he said with all those unsportsmanlike calls, he said he'd rather tell his team whoa than sick 'em, which I thought was an interesting thing, instead of telling them that, hey, get a little bit more amped up, instead of, he just had to reel him back in a little bit. So he'd rather have his team fired up, and that's where they cross the line. So continue.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say it's a weird thing because we've heard all the time how Tomlin needs to discipline these guys more. and that he tries too hard to be everyone's friend. I'm not saying those are my words, but I mean, you've seen some of the egos running wild in this locker room since Tomlin took over a very long time ago now. But it's interesting to see him kind of take this route. I think it's a route a lot of fans maybe didn't want him to take, but when you say it, the point you brought up, you want to see these guys play with some fire, play with some passion, and maybe there were a couple incidents where it's like, really, did we need to do that there? But what do you take away? Did you think it was too much? Did you think it was too little?
At times, obviously, you don't want to take those penalties because if it's a critical situation, you just can't have that happen. I think there's ways to avoid it, but I think maybe, the receiving core in Pittsburgh has had a lot of interesting characters over the past, half decade to decade. And Pickens obviously has brought in his own energy. And then Deontay Johnson, I think Deontay Johnson was just fired up to be back out there. I think that's part of the reason, but they do need to dial it back, I think, a little bit. I mean, because in the end, I mean, it's a 7-point game. I mean, those penalties could be huge and very costly if those aren't taken care of.
Mm-hmm. And one of them, I'm not going to attribute it to the wrong one. It was either Pickens or Johnson. I can't remember which, but they're doing it right in front of a coach. And again, I can't remember if it was Tomlin or someone else, and there was nothing done. There's no hesitancy from whatever player it was to be like, oh, damn, coach is right there. I better not do this. But as a fan, they've struggled this year, and you kind of like to see them playing with a little spark under it. But then, even watching from the couch or from the stands, you have to kind of go, okay, you should really stop now, because that's a thing that they like to flag, the taunting penalties, and you have to know where that fine line is. Say something quick and get out of there. Don't get up in their face and start pointing, because I think when the gestures get added to the mix, I think that's where they really like to throw the flag. And so I think it's just a matter of, you want to see some of that from your team, but also you have to know where the border is, and you can't cross the border. But moving on, they'll play the Jaguars this week. Jaguars are what, 6-2, 5-2?
5-2.
5-2. Yeah, 5-2 and top the AFC South. This is gonna be a tricky game, which is a weird thing to say about the Jags. I still can't mentally get them out of the Blake Bortles era, which they beat Pittsburgh in a divisional round playoff game with Blake Bortles, but we won't talk about that too much. But Nate, on paper, what do you make of this matchup for Pittsburgh?
Well, I think, this is going to be another tough game. Trevor Lawrence has, played a lot better than his rookie season, being one of the better quarterbacks in the AFC. And I think he has the receiving core and the ground game to get it done. So he has a lot of great weapons around him. Christian Kirk, Calvin Ridley back. Also, Travis Etienne on the ground. I mean, one of the top running backs in the nation, or in the country, in the league. Thinking college terms right now.
No, you're good.
Thinking the Clemson duo there. But anyways,
you're excited for what's ahead too for our next topic.
But Etienne, I mean, he's third in the NFL in touchdowns, 7 touchdowns, fourth in rush yards. So I mean, we've talked about, with Cam Hayward not in the middle there on the run defense. I mean, it's struggled at times. So that's going to be huge to see how the Steelers can, match up against Etienne. But this offense is going to be a big test. And we've seen, I mean, even last week, we saw the Steelers going against a pretty solid offense, especially in the pass game. And I thought they did well. I mean, besides a couple big Puka Nacua plays, I mean, he was dominant. I mean, finally got to see what he was like, all the hype around him. But they kept Cooper Kupp to 2 receptions on 7 targets. So I think in the pass game, they did pretty well. So I think that it's going to be a big matchup. The Jags offense versus Steelers defense. We saw Joey Porter Jr. make a couple plays against the Rams. So some of those guys are going to have to really be in the mix. But offensively, again, just touching back on the Rams game, I think the one promising sign for the Steelers, they were 3 for 3 in the red zone. Prior to that, they were 2 for 7 all season long. So I think finally getting, not only did they score on the ground for the first time this year, but also they were 100% from the red zone. They looked good from the red zone. The blocking there on the ground game was good. Pickett made smart decisions. So I think that's another thing looking forward to is how can they continue on that trend of being solid in the red zone and, offensively take from that second half of the Rams game and go against the Jaguars secondary that's not all that good either. So, it's going to be an interesting matchup. And I think it's one of the more overshadowed matchups of the year in the AFC. I mean, at least at this point in the season, no one knew what the Steelers were going to be. And no one really knew that the Jaguars were going to be this good. I mean, beating the Bills, they've had a couple big wins, but in terms of the race right now, early on in the season, this is a huge matchup in the AFC. I mean, a 5-2 team versus a 4-2 Steelers team. This is a big win for whoever can pull away with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the main talking point after that promising second half is, can they put together a complete game this week against Jacksonville? And I think a couple of the other points you hit on were things I wanted to mention. ETN, obviously, I think is going to be one of the biggest storylines in this game. We talked about it last week, just how depleted the Rams running back situation was, and Henderson shows up and has a really solid game. The run defense for Pittsburgh has been a really soft issue all year long. And then you mentioned the receiving core. That's a very talented receiving core they have in Jacksonville right now. Ridley, I believe, had a pretty quiet game against the Saints on Thursday, which is another storyline of itself. The Jags had a pretty long week, long rest, I should say, and they're going to be well rested coming into this one, making the road game maybe a little bit easier. But the other thing is the Jags let the Saints back in to that game. They built a really solid lead, and it kind of looked like everything was just going to get phoned in till the end, kind of. And then we saw the Saints come back and tie it up, and then they were a dropped ball in the end zone away from potentially sending that game to overtime. And the Steelers, they're 4-2, and I don't know if you know this or not, but it hasn't necessarily been pretty. It hasn't been Pittsburgh doing anything crazily impressive to get to those 4 wins and 2 losses. But they're a team that if you make a mistake, they're going to find some way to scratch and claw its way in front and pull out a win, and it's not going to be pretty. But if Jacksonville leaves the door open like they did against the Saints, I think Pittsburgh could really do some damage to them here. But I'd prefer to see Pittsburgh play 4 quarters of football, getting back to the main point. I'd like to see them put it all together and not leave us scratching our heads for 3/4 of the game going, what happened to what they were doing last week? And then again, miraculously, Kenny Pickett puts it all together in the 4th quarter. The playbook gets a little more spread out. They need to play a complete game. And I don't know if I believe that they'll do that this week, because I think Jacksonville's pretty damn good. But I think it'll be a close one regardless, Nate.
Yeah, and, in terms of predictions, Jacksonville 2.5-point favorites coming into Acrisure Stadium. The one thing, if the Steelers are going to win, as we mentioned, we need to see 4 quarters of offense from the Steelers. The Jaguars are 31st in pass defense in the NFL. So it's a great game for Pickett to exploit that and get going, through the air. I mean, he has 1 game in his career of 2 touchdown passes. So if any game is the time for him to start rolling, it's this one versus the Jaguars in terms of passing. But I don't think Jacksonville makes those mistakes that they did against the Saints. I think that long rest, as you mentioned, is going to help them. And I think they come into Pittsburgh with a 30-24 victory over the Steelers. And again, until we're proven otherwise, I don't know if the Steelers offense can play a full 60 minutes.
Absolutely. And I think my prediction is going to be pretty close to yours. I'm going to go 31-20 in favor of the Jaguars. And you might be asking, is there anything in addition to what we've been saying? Here's some sabermetrics for you right here. When my wife and I watch the games, the Steelers are 4-0. When Kayla, my wife, has a terrible towel in hand, they have not lost. San Francisco, I didn't know where it was, so we didn't have it. Second week I gave it to her, they won. They played Houston. I think that was a few weeks later. She was doing some stuff around the house. We had a busy weekend. They lost. Didn't get the terrible towel out. Every game this year, she has had terrible towel in hand. The Steelers have won. And you're like, Nick, please shut up. I'm getting there. We're not going to be able to watch this game, or at least not the full thing.
Oh, no.
So that means, unless we're going to a family function with terrible towel in hand, which you wouldn't put past most people, it's going to be a rough one for Pittsburgh. But that might be my biggest deciding factor in this one. Hopefully anyone found that amusing at all. But we're going to move on now to, I gave my score, right?
Yeah,
31-20. Yeah, there we go. There we
go.
go. We're professionals. We're professionals, Nate.
I'd love to count up our predictions. I have no idea where we stand this year.
I have no clue. I can go look. That'll be a task only I should have to go back and withstand.
Or we make Ethan since he's not here.
Or we could do Ethan.
It's his homework for the week.
It would be fun. He's got to send me that text, and he's got to give me our records. He could totally lie about our records, and I want to go double check them too. So just putting that out there. Anyway, Notre Dame coming off of a bye. Pitt coming off a loss, and what I've dubbed a slide gate. I don't know if anyone else has used that. I'm sure someone else has. We'll talk about that right now. And Nate, be very careful about what you say about this slide, because we will get attacked if you say the wrong thing. So with that thought floating in your head, what did you think of the slide towards the end of the Wake Forest game?
I read some things, and it's, they're not wrong, but I mean, well, this is the same thing to go with the whole deal with Kenny Pickett spotting at the end of the Steelers game. Why can't there be the technology to show the specific spotting of the football, just like, you can track how fast a running back is, or how far, a ball is thrown through the air, like, that type of statistics and measurements. Why can't you have that with the spotting of the ball? And this one's tougher because it's all about, where did Christian Veilleux start his slide? And it's tough because part of it comes in because of the Kenny Pickett rule from the Wake Forest ACC championship game a few years ago. And Veilleux did look like he started his slide just a half inch too early, and that cost him the game, cost him the spot. Didn't cost him the game. There was a ton of other factors that Pitt, fell in this one, but it's a tough spot. Veilleux, I mean, it's a redshirt sophomore. He'll learn from that to just run out of bounds. You're going to have, 4 more plays at least to take time off the clock and punt again. So I think the call was right, as disappointing as it is for Pitt fans. He did look like he was starting to get ready for a slide, and the rule book, that's, as soon as you start your slide, and even if it was a yard behind the line or at the line, he still was right there, and he should have just continued to run for the first down instead of sliding early. But it's something you'll learn from. I mean, he's a young quarterback, and that's what I know Pat Narduzzi had talked about. So tough one. I mean, Wake Forest went on to score there with 9 seconds left. So, I mean, but there was a lot of other things that could have happened in that game that Pitt didn't do well.
Mm-hmm. And I think you hit the nail on the head there, which is something I say every time you talk. I think we should probably make a jar for it, similar to a tip jar at this point. There were people saying he takes 2-3 more steps before he initially slides, blah, blah, blah. It looks like he's a yard short, and that back leg starts to bend a bit. And I would assume, based off what I've read, that is where it's considered to be beginning. It's really close. And just to add on to what you said about him not needing to slide, I do agree that that's something that where he would make a better decision as he matures. But you're putting yourself in his shoes. You have the potential to win this game in his second ever start. And I mean, you don't want to make a costly turnover and take contact you don't need to have. So I think he's like, okay, I'm close, I'm safe, I'm just going to slide now. And he elected to go for that rather than potentially commit a turnover. And that's just something he's going to learn, is that he needs to be trusted in that situation to maybe make the smarter play and just run towards the out of bounds marker behind that blocker he had right in front of him.